I didn't realize my stepmother had cleared out the attic until I found my mother's handwritten recipe book sitting at the very bottom of our neighborhood's communal dumpster, waterlogged from the morning rain. When I confronted my father about it, he didn't look up from his tablet. He just sighed and said, "Leonie, it's just paper, and Marisol needed the space for her yoga studio." The casual dismissiveness of his voice cut deeper than Marisol's actual malice. My mother had been gone for barely 2 years, her absence still a heavy, suffocating fog in the corners of the house she had designed, planted, and loved. Yet my father had remarried within 8 months, transforming from a grieving widower into a doting, pliable shadow of a man whose sole purpose was keeping his new, younger wife comfortable. Marisol was a woman of aggressive minimalism, a practitioner of clearing out negative energy, which apparently translated to erasing every trace of the woman who came before her. I stood in the kitchen that afternoon, my fingers still damp from the rain, holding the ruined notebook. The blue ink of my mother's elegant cursive had bled into illegible shadows across the pulp pages. I looked at Marisol, who was casually slicing an avocado at the island, the very island my mother had chosen the marble for. She didn't look guilty. She looked bored. "It was clutter, Leonie," Marisol said, her voice dripping with a practiced, soothing serenity that made my stomach turn. "Holding onto physical objects blocks the soul from evolving. I did you a favor, really." Your father agreed. I turned to my father, waiting for the man who used to hold my hand at my mother's oncology appointments, the man who promised we would protect her memory together. He finally looked up, his eyes sliding past mine to rest on Marisol. There was a pathetic, desperate dependency in his gaze. He was terrified of losing his second chance at youth, even if it cost him his daughter. "You have to let go of the past, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice flat, rehearsed. "Marisol is the future of this family now." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The rage inside me didn't burn hot. It went ice cold, settling deep into my chest like winter frost. I looked at the two of them, perfectly aligned against me in the kitchen that used to smell like vanilla and yeast, and I realized that my father hadn't just allowed her to throw away my mother's things. He had handed her the trash bags. They thought I was just a grieving 22-year-old college student with no leverage, living under their roof because I couldn't afford my own place yet. They thought I would just cry in my bedroom and eventually comply with the new order of things. But as I walked up the stairs, carrying the ruined notebook like a casualty of war, I remembered something Marisol and my father had forgotten. My mother wasn't just a collector of recipes and old porcelain. She was a meticulous businesswoman who had built the very consulting firm that funded my father's early retirement. And she had left a paper trail that no amount of Marisol's decluttering could touch. The next morning, the house was filled with the rhythmic, aggressive thumping of a contractor's hammer. I walked downstairs to find two men tearing down the built-in bookshelves in the den. The ones my mother had spent 3 weekends staining herself. Her hands stained a deep walnut brown that took weeks to wash out. Marisol was standing by the window, sipping green tea, gesturing gracefully with her free hand toward the wall. "We want it completely flush," she was telling the foreman. "Clean lines, no dark corners for energy to get trapped." My father was standing just outside the room, checking his watch, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a text message. He couldn't look at the shelves, and he certainly couldn't look at me. I walked past him without a word, heading straight for the small backyard shed where my mother used to keep her gardening tools. Marisol hadn't touched the shed yet. To her, it was just a dirty shack beneath her notice. But I knew what was inside. Tucked beneath a stack of rusted tomato cages and a tarp that smelled of damp earth was a heavy, fireproof lockbox. My mother had given me the key on her final night in the hospice room, when her voice was nothing more than a thready whisper against my ear. "Don't let your father handle the estate alone, Leonie," she had whispered. "He's a good man, but he's weak. He breaks when the wind blows too hard." At the time, I thought she was just being overly cautious, perhaps a bit cynical from the medication. Now, as I knelt on the dirt floor of the shed, my knees sinking into the damp soil, I realized she had known him better than anyone else ever could. I unlocked the box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, wasn't jewelry or sentimental trinkets. It was a thick manila folder labeled Firm Restructuring and Personal Trust Assets. I sat back on my heels, flipping through the pages. My mother had founded Apex Consulting 15 years ago. When she became ill, she stepped down, but she didn't sell her shares. Instead, she had structured the company's ownership so that my father received a comfortable monthly disbursement from the dividends, conditional upon him maintaining the family home as a primary residence for both of us until I turned 25. If the home's integrity or its contents were fundamentally altered, or if I was displaced, the voting rights of her majority shares automatically transferred to a trust, managed exclusively by me and her former business partner, Eris. More importantly, the deed to the house wasn't entirely his. My mother had bought the property before they were married. It was tied directly to the corporate entity of the firm. My father didn't own the house. He was essentially a life tenant, courtesy of my mother's generosity. And Marisol's pristine, minimalist yoga studio was currently being built on a foundation of legal sand. I closed the folder, the heavy paper snapping shut in the quiet of the shed. I could hear Marisol laughing from the open kitchen window, a light, tinkling sound that carried across the lawn. She thought she was erasing a ghost. She had no idea she was evicting herself. That evening, dinner was an exercise in performative harmony. Marisol had prepared a raw macrobiotic salad that tasted mostly of dirt and vinegar, serving it on sleek, matte black ceramic plates she had bought to replace my mother's vintage Mikasa china. My father ate dutifully, keeping his head down, chewing with the joyless compliance of a prisoner trying to avoid solitary confinement. "Leonie, darling," Marisol said, setting her fork down with a soft click. "The contractors will be starting on the sunroom next week. We're converting it into a meditation space. I'll need you to clear out those old botanical prints on the wall by Sunday." The prints were original watercolors my mother had collected during a trip to Kyoto when she was pregnant with me. They were the last things left in the main house that still held her scent, faint lavender and linen. "No," I said quietly, picking up my water glass. The silence that followed was heavy. My father's fork paused midair. Marisol blinked, her serene mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing a sharp, calculating coldness underneath. "I beg your pardon," she asked, her voice dropping its airy cadence. "I said no," I repeated, looking her dead in the eye. "The prints stay. In fact, the renovations in the sunroom need to stop entirely." Marisol let out a soft, condescending chuckle and turned to my father. "Nurin, love, please talk to your daughter. We discussed this. Negative attachments to physical objects are clearly hindering her grief process." My father, Nurin, cleared his throat, refusing to meet my gaze. "Leonie, please don't make a scene. Marisol is just trying to improve the house. It's her home now, too. We have to move forward." "It isn't her home," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And legally speaking, Dad, it's barely yours." I reached into my canvas tote bag on the floor and pulled out a single, photocopied page of the corporate trust agreement I had retrieved from the shed. I slid it across the table, right over the matte black placemat, stopping it next to Marisol's salad bowl. "What is this?" my father muttered, adjusting his reading glasses as he picked up the paper. "That is the clause in Mom's corporate restructuring framework," I said, my voice steady and measured. "The house belongs to Apex Consulting, which Mom founded. You have a lifetime tenancy, Dad, but it is strictly conditional. Section 4, paragraph B. Any structural modifications, alterations to the historical integrity of the property, or actions resulting in the emotional or physical displacement of her heirs, meaning me, constitutes a breach of the trust." My father's face drained of color. He knew my mother's business mind. He had just spent the last 2 years pretending her intelligence had died with her. "Leonie," he whispered, his hands starting to tremble slightly as his eyes scanned the legal jargon. "You wouldn't." "What is she talking about, Nurin?" Marisol demanded, her voice losing all its meditative grace, snapping like a dry twig. "It's just a house. You told me you owned it." "He doesn't," I said, looking directly at her. "And if another hammer hits a wall in this house, I'm calling Eris. We will trigger the immediate audit of the estate, revoke the tenancy, and freeze the dividend disbursements that pay for your organic groceries and that new car in the driveway. Marisol's fork fell against the ceramic plate with a sharp clatter that echoed through the dining room. The serene, enlightened guru vanished, replaced instantly by a woman whose financial foundation had just groaned under her feet. She stared at my father, her eyes wide and sharp, waiting for him to contradict me, to laugh off my threat, to perform the masculine authority she expected of him. But my father just sat there, his head sinking slightly into his shoulders. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He knew exactly what my mother was capable of when she sat at a mahogany desk with a pen in her hand. "Nurin," Marisol's voice was no longer a gentle melody, it was a demand. "Tell her she's being ridiculous. You signed the deed transfer paperwork with me last month." "He signed an intent to transfer document prepared by your private notary, Marisol," I corrected, not letting my father answer. "Which is legally worthless because you cannot transfer a title you do not hold. This house is a corporate asset of Apex. Mom protected it because she knew exactly how quickly you would try to dissolve her life's work once she wasn't here to defend it." "Leonie, please," my father finally spoke, his voice cracking. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine, but I didn't move to meet it. "We're a family. Your mother wouldn't want us living in a legal war zone. She loved this house." "She loved the people in it," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt heavier than a shout. "She loved the daughter she spent 22 years raising, and she loved the husband who promised to look after her legacy. You let Marisol put her recipes in the dumpster, Dad. You let her rip down the shelves she built with her own blood and sweat. Where was your sense of family then?" He couldn't answer. He looked down at his plate, his lower lip trembling. For a second, I felt a pang of the old love I had for him, the father who used to carry me on his shoulders at the beach. But then I looked at the matte black plates, the empty spaces where our family photos used to hang, and the coldness returned. Marisol pushed her chair back, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. "This is absurd. I am not going to be threatened in my own home by a child throwing a tantrum over old paper and dusty paintings. Nurin, we are going upstairs. You will call your lawyer first thing in the morning." She stood up, expecting him to follow her like he always did. She walked toward the hallway, her posture rigid, her silk loungewear rustling. My father started to push his chair back to follow her, a conditioned reflex. "If you go up those stairs with her tonight, Dad," I said quietly, remaining seated, "I call Eris at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and by noon the corporate audit begins." My father froze, caught like a rusted pendulum between the woman who controlled his present and the ghost of the woman who still controlled his future. For a long, agonizing moment, the house fell completely silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Marisol had tried to paint white last week before I stopped her. My father's weight remained poised on the edge of his seat, his hands flat against the table. He looked up at the staircase, where Marisol stood on the landing, her face twisted into a mask of pure, indignant entitlement. "Nurin," she hissed, her voice cutting through the shadows, "are you coming or not?" He looked at her, then down at the copy of the trust agreement sitting under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier. The legal seal of my mother's firm seemed to catch the light, a silent, unyielding sentinel. Finally, with a slow, heavy deflation of his shoulders, my father pulled his chair back in. He didn't stand up. I think I need to look over these papers tonight, Marisol," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Marisol's breath hitched. It was the first time since their wedding that he hadn't immediately bent to her will. Her eyes darted to me, flashing with a venom that completely dismantled her peaceful facade. "Fine," she snapped. "Enjoy your bedtime stories." She turned on her heel, her heavy steps vibrating through the ceiling as she marched into the master bedroom and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the remaining glassware in the kitchen. Left alone in the dining room, the space between my father and me felt wider than an ocean. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the photocopied document toward him. He didn't read it immediately. Instead, he just stared at my mother's signature at the bottom, the sharp, elegant cursive he had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and grocery lists. "She always was 3 steps ahead of everyone," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, though his eyes were brimming with tears. "Even me." "She didn't do this to trap you, Dad," I said, my voice tight. "She did this to protect you. She knew you couldn't say no to someone who made you feel young again, but you let her erase Mom. You let her treat me like an inconvenience in my own mother's house." "I was lonely, Leonie," he pleaded, finally looking at me, his eyes red and desperate. "When your mother died, the silence in this house was deafening. Marisol," she brought noise. She brought energy. I didn't mean to let her go this far. I just wanted to stop hurting. "So you let her throw away the recipe book?" I asked. The image of that waterlogged notebook in the dumpster flashes behind my eyes. "You let her tear down the shelves. Grief isn't an excuse for cowardice, Dad." He flinched, the word hitting him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead into his palms, looking old, fragile, and utterly defeated. I stood up, leaving him alone at the table with the remnants of Marisol's cold dinner and the legal handcuffs my mother had forged from the grave. As I walked out of the room, I knew the battle wasn't over. Marisol wasn't the type to pack her bags quietly. But as I reached the stairs, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 long years. The solid, unshakable presence of my mother standing right beside me. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. There were no contractors, no sounds of hammers, and no smooth jazz playing from Marisol's smart speakers. When I walked down to the kitchen, the matte black plates from the night before were still sitting in the sink, untouched. A half-empty cup of herbal tea had grown a thin skin over its surface on the counter. My father was sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard. He had a heavy wool blanket draped over his shoulders despite the mild spring air, looking out at the patches of lawn where my mother's flower beds used to bloom before Marisol replaced them with white gravel. "She went to a hotel," he said without turning around as he heard the screen door creak open. "Marisol?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "She said she couldn't breathe in a house full of toxic stagnation," he murmured, quoting her favorite buzzwords, though his voice lacked any conviction. "She wants me to sell my shares in Apex to Eris. She wants us to take the money, buy a condo in the city, and start fresh. No baggage." I walked over to the porch railing, looking down at him. "And what did you say?" He let out a long, ragged breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of his blanket. "I told her I couldn't. I told her the shares aren't mine to sell like that. Even if I wanted to, Eris wouldn't buy them out without your consent, Leonie. Your mother tied it up too tightly." He finally looked up at me, his eyes sunken and tired. "Marisol told me that if I don't find a way around this trust by the end of the week, she's filing for divorce." It was the ultimate play. Marisol was leveraging the one thing she knew he was terrified of, being alone in the dark again. She was testing his limits, betting that his fear of a second abandonment would outweigh his respect for my mother's memory. "She's bluffing, Dad," I said softly, though I knew it didn't matter if she was or wasn't. "She doesn't want a divorce. She wants the lifestyle this house and Mom's company provide for her. If she leaves you, she leaves empty-handed. She knows exactly what the prenuptial agreement she signed says." My father blinked, a sudden look of confusion crossing his face. "The prenup? How do you know about the prenup?" "Because Mom made Eris draft a template for 1 year ago, just in case something happened to her," I said, looking out at the yard. "She left it in the lockbox, too. Eris made sure you used it before you married Marisol. You signed it, Dad. If Marisol divorces you within the first 3 years, she gets nothing but her personal belongings." My father stared at me, completely stunned. The realization was washing over him like an icy wave. The woman he had upended his life for, the woman he had allowed to desecrate his first wife's memory, was trapped in the same legal net as he was. Just then, the front door clicked open, and the sharp, distinctive click of Marisol's designer heels echoed through the foyer. She hadn't gone to a hotel. She had gone to get reinforcements. I walked back into the foyer to find Marisol standing beside a tall, sharp-featured man holding a leather briefcase. She had changed into a tailored beige trench coat, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun. The frantic anger from the night before was completely gone, replaced by a cold, triumphant smile. "Leonie," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing warmth. "This is Vance Caldwell. He's a senior partner specializing in estate disputes." My father crept into the hallway behind me, clutching his wool blanket around his chest like a shield. Vance didn't look at him. His eyes went straight to me, analyzing my faded college sweatshirt and jeans, instantly dismissing me as a minor hurdle. "Mr. Nuren," Vance said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "Your wife contacted me regarding some administrative confusion regarding your late wife's estate. I've reviewed the public corporate filings for Apex Consulting this morning. While your daughter is correct that the property is held under a corporate umbrella, she is fundamentally misinterpreting the operational bylaws." Marisol crossed her arms, leaning against the archway. "We don't need to make this a legal circus, Leonie. Vance has already explained to me that a dead woman's wishes cannot indefinitely paralyze a living man's estate. Your mother's little trust has holes." I didn't blink. I stood on the bottom step of the staircase, looking down at them. "Is that so, Mr. Caldwell? Which holes exactly?" Vance smiled, a patronizing tilt of his lips as he popped the brass latches on his briefcase. "Section 4 of the restructuring framework relies heavily on the definition of material alteration and emotional displacement. In a court of law, removing old bookshelves and redecorating a sunroom for wellness purposes does not constitute property damage or air displacement. It constitutes standard property maintenance. If you attempt to freeze your father's dividends, we will file an immediate injunction for tortious interference. You'll be tied up in litigation for years, losing whatever inheritance you think you're protecting to legal fees." Marisol let out a soft, satisfied hum, stepping closer to my father. She reached out and patted his arm, though her eyes remained locked on mine. "You see, love, I told you it was just a misunderstanding. We can keep building our studio." My father looked at the lawyer, a desperate flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. He wanted to believe them. He wanted the easy way out where everyone just smiled and pretended the dumpster outside wasn't full of my mother's life. "That's a very compelling argument, Mr. Caldwell," I said, leaning my hand against the banister. "But you only looked at the public filings. You didn't look at the private corporate operating agreement." I pulled a small, silver flash drive from my pocket and held it up between my fingers. "Because if you had," I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet foyer, "you would know that Apex Consulting isn't a standard corporation. It's an S-corp with a mandatory buy-sell provision tied to a key man life insurance policy. And my mother didn't just protect the house. She protected the clients." Vance Caldwell's smile faltered, his thumb pausing on the leather lid of his briefcase. A quiet, tense stillness settled over the foyer. Marisol's hand stayed frozen on my father's arm, her fingers tightening slightly, sensing the sudden shift in the room's temperature. "What exactly do you mean by that, Leonie?" Vance asked, his professional warmth evaporating into a flat, analytical tone. "My mother built Apex on personal relationships," I said, stepping down from the last stair until I was standing directly in front of them. 80% of the firm's recurring revenue comes from 3 legacy manufacturing accounts. Before she died, she didn't just write a trust for this house. She signed an amendment to the client service agreements. I plugged the flash drive into the small tablet sitting on the entry console, tapping the screen to bring up a scanned PDF document. I turned the screen toward Vance. "Every single one of those legacy clients has a non-assignable key person clause," I explained, my voice steady, completely devoid of emotion. "If my mother passed away, the accounts were contractually mandated to be managed exclusively by Eris, or, in the event of Eris's retirement, passed down to me. My father has a financial interest in the dividends, yes, but he has 0 operational authority. And more importantly, Section 9 states that if the heir, me, notifies the clients of a hostile restructuring or family litigation that destabilizes the firm's legacy, the clients have the immediate right to terminate their contracts without penalty." Vance leaned in, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal paragraphs on the screen. The confidence in his posture began to crumble, his jaw tightening as he realized what he was looking at. "You're bluffing," Marisol said, though her voice lacked its earlier venom, a tremor of panic breaking through her pristine facade. "You wouldn't destroy your own mother's company just to spite us." "It's not spite, Marisol. It's preservation," I said, looking from her to my father. "If you take me to court over a material alteration injunction, I won't just fight you in probate. I will call the CEOs of those 3 companies tomorrow morning. I will tell them that my father's new wife is attempting to liquidate the estate and dissolve the corporate foundation. They will pull their accounts by Friday." I turned my gaze entirely to my father, whose face had gone completely gray. "If those clients leave, Dad, Apex Consulting becomes an empty shell," I said softly. "The dividends dry up. The monthly disbursements stop. The money you use to pay the property taxes, the insurance, and Marisol's credit cards disappears. If you let her fight me for this house, she won't just win a yoga studio. She'll win a bankrupt estate and a mountain of legal debt." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vance closed his briefcase with a heavy, final click, turning his head to look at Marisol with an expression that said everything her money couldn't buy. Vance didn't say another word. He adjusted his tie, gave my father a stiff, curt nod, and walked out the front door, leaving the heavy oak portal to click shut behind him. Marisol stood frozen in the center of the foyer, her expensive trench coat suddenly looking like an oversized armor that couldn't protect her. She stared at the blank tablet screen, then slowly turned her eyes toward my father. The serene, modern mystic was entirely gone. In her place was a woman who had calculated every step of her social ascension, only to realize she had climbed onto a trapdoor. "Nurin," she whispered, her voice sharp and frantic. "Do something. She's threatening your livelihood. She's threatening our life." My father didn't look at her. He was staring down at his own bare feet on the hardwood floor. For months, he had allowed himself to be swept along by Marisol's vibrant, loud, demanding reality, because it was easier than sitting in the quiet grief my mother had left behind. But looking at the empty walls where our family history used to hang, and hearing the cold math of his own financial ruin, something inside him finally shifted. "She's not threatening it, Marisol," he said, his voice incredibly quiet, but heavier than I had heard it in a very long time. "She's just showing me the mirror." "What is that supposed to mean?" Marisol hissed, stepping closer to him, her fingers clawing into his wool blanket. "We are your family now. I am your wife." "And Charlotte was my wife for 24 years, my father said, finally lifting his head to look at her. It was the first time since my mother's funeral that I heard him use her actual name instead of a generic pronoun. "She built everything we are standing on, and I let you put her life in a dumpster." Marisol recoiled as if he had struck her. "I did this for us, to give you a fresh start. You were drowning in this house." "No," my father whispered, tears finally leaking over his lower lids, tracking down the deep lines of his face. "I was mourning, and you made me think that forgetting her was the same thing as healing." He turned away from her, walking slow, deliberate steps toward the kitchen. Marisol stood in the hallway, her chest heaving, looking at me with a desperate, feral hatred. She knew she had lost the lawyer, she had lost the company, and now she was losing the man she thought she could manipulate with a smile and a cup of green tea. "You think you've won, don't you?" She spat at me, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you're so smart, sitting on your mother's ghost." "I don't care about winning, Marisol," I said, picking up my tablet from the console and sliding the flash drive back into my pocket. "I care about this house, and by Sunday night, I want every single piece of your minimalist furniture out of it." The next 3 days passed in a tense, mechanical blur. The house smelled of packing tape and cardboard boxes instead of sage and essential oils. Marisol didn't speak to me, and she barely spoke to my father. She moved through the rooms like an angry spirit, wrapping her expensive Scandinavian vases and linen throws in bubble wrap. Her movements sharp, violent, and devoid of her usual grace. My father spent most of those days in the garden shed. I watched him from the kitchen window, sitting on an overturned plastic crate, holding an old canvas tote bag that contained the few things of my mother's we had managed to salvage from the dumpster. He looked older, his shoulders curved under the weight of a realization that no amount of apologizing could ever truly fix. But for the first time in 2 years, He wasn't running away from the quiet. He was sitting in it. On Sunday evening, a white moving van pulled up to the curb. Marisol didn't ask for help, and neither of us offered. She had hired 2 young college students to haul her boxes down the driveway. Her pristine, minimalist world was loaded into the back of a rented truck in less than 2 hours. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, amber shadows across the bare hardwood floors of the living room, Marisol stood by the front door. She had her designer suitcase in one hand and her car keys in the other. She looked at me, her eyes hollowed out by resentment. "He'll never forgive you for this, you know," she said, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper. "You've turned him into a broken old man." "He was already broken, Marisol," I said, standing in the center of the empty hallway. "You just tried to paint over the cracks so you wouldn't have to look at them. I'm letting him heal." She let out a short, bitter laugh, turned on her heel, and walked out, letting the heavy oak door swing shut behind her. The click of her heels on the porch steps faded, followed by the distant rumble of the moving van pulling away from the curb. Then came the silence. It wasn't the suffocating, hostile silence of the past few weeks, nor was it the deafening grief my father had been so terrified of. It was a clean, open space. The house felt larger, lighter, as if it had finally taken a deep, long overdue breath. I walked down the hallway to the den. The walls were scarred where the bookshelves had been torn down, exposed plaster and dark outlines showing exactly where my mother's walnut stains had protected the wood for over a decade. My father was standing there, staring at the empty wall, a paintbrush and a can of spackle sitting on the floor by his feet. He didn't turn around when I walked in, but his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "I don't think I can find the exact match for the stain," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "But I remember the name of the lumber yard where she bought the wood. I thought, maybe we could start there next weekend." I walked over and stood beside him, looking at the raw, unfinished wall. It was going to take months to repair the damage Marisol had done. The house was empty, mismatched, and scarred. But as I reached out and gently placed my hand over my father's trembling forearm, I knew the foundation was still solid. My mother had built it to last.